All right. Good evening, everybody. Or it's my evening here, probably your afternoon in most places. My name is Ed Gerrard. I am a board member of the Guild of Music Supervisors representing the East Coast. I'm so happy to be part of this great night tonight on the panels regarding podcasting, which is something we've been people have been asking for us to present and to get involved in, so we're excited to have it. First off, I want to thank our sponsor for tonight, Synch Floor and Songs for Podcasters, Kurt DeBeek. Kurt is a 20-year Microsoft veteran with experience as an engineer, architect, technology strategist, and general manager. He has worked on mobile productivity, real-time communications, multimedia systems, distributed security, and operating systems. Wow, that's a lot. An accomplished inventor with 37 technology patents, Kirk is also the owner and founder of Brick Lane Records, a Seattle independent music label. Synch Floor is a marketplace of commercial music for use in advertisement, film, TV, games, podcasts, and more. Built around the concept of natural language music search, Synch Floor has created an intuitive and innovative engine for music discovery, enabling creators of all kinds to easily find and secure rights to independent music from around the world. The company is also the maker of Songs for Podcasters, a modern podcast-specific music licensing experience made for consumers, small businesses, and creative professionals. I want to have Kurt speak a little bit, and we are so happy that he is sponsoring this panel for tonight. So Kurt, on to you.
Hi everybody. Thank you so much to the Guild for having us and give us the opportunity to sponsor part of this series. The Guild has been doing such great work to bring the community together to have conversations about what's really important in music and media, and bringing those things together and looking at the overall trends that we see in terms of media, new media in particular. Podcasting is this phenomenon. And so we're really excited to be part of the first sort of panel, really bringing people together to talk about podcasting and music. The reason we built Songs for Podcasters is because we saw this need to take the sort of fear and friction out of the process of acquiring the best independent commercial music from around the world for podcasts, where you have people of all stripes coming in and wanting to get access to that content, but not knowing sort of the ropes and how to do it. And we felt that we could do something about that by creating a specific experience to podcasting and for podcasters. There are many things that are going to happen as sort of this ecosystem evolves, and as music continues to evolve in terms of the ways that it's used and the ways that artists and businesses in the music businesses can monetize that usage. And so we're excited to be part of that, and excited to be part of the future of music and the future of the conversation about the use of music, especially in podcasts. And we're starting that here today. And so I'd say just let's take it away and get right into it.
Great. Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate that. So I want to introduce our moderator for tonight, Joe Wong. Joe is a Los Angeles-based recording artist, podcast host, and composer. Over the past 20 years, Joe has performed and recorded with artists such as Marnie Stern, Mary Timony, and Parts and Labor. Night Creatures is Joe's first solo album as a vocalist, and it was released by Decca Records last month. Congratulations, Joe.
Thank you.
As host and co-producer of the popular music-based The Trap Set podcast, Joe has interviewed over 300 musicians from all backgrounds, generations, and genres, including The Dam, Phil Collins, Sharon Van Etten, Angela Olsen, Sheila E., and Clyde Stubberfield, and Billy Gibbons, as well. As a composer, Joe has scored films and TV shows including Masters of None, nice, Russian Doll, very nice, The Midnight Gospel, and To All the Boys trilogy. His latest project, Simperie Louise premieres on HBO this month. I hope I pronounced that right. But anyway, Joe, take it away and good luck.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks to the Guild for having me. I'm very much a non-music supervising interloper. So thanks for letting me invade your meeting. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists one by one so that they can talk a little bit about their backgrounds. So we'll go in alphabetical order, starting with Tyler Batchelor from Kobalt.
Everyone, thanks for having me. I work at Kobalt Music in the Synch department. I clear across all media types on behalf of our writers, artists, publisher partners, and label partners. Most importantly, doing a whole lot more podcast licensing recently. So very much looking forward to having this discussion.
Next, we have Stephanie Jenz from Wondery.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Jenz, as Joe said. I'm the VP of New Shows, Always On Shows at Wondery. My background before I came to audio was in television, reality, documentary, and unscripted. So I have a little crossover. And I was a big fan of music and composers and supervisors in both realms. So I'm super excited to be here, too.
And then we have Scott Velasquez from Frisson.
That's correct. I'm Scott. My background is actually I used to run music festivals for a while. And then I have recently moved over to doing podcast supervision full time. And so I started my company and we do everything. We've done everything from Boonga Boonga that's out right now to Shrink Next Door to Dr. Death to We Crash, all of these things. So it's been a journey so far.
Great. So I'll direct questions at each of you individually, but then everybody else is free to
introduce myself.
Sorry.
That's okay. Hey, I'm Kathleen Smith. My company is Pink Jumpsuit Music. We do music clearance, consulting, and supervision. And I work on podcasts, TV shows, films. There's a Netflix show coming out tomorrow called Song Exploder that I worked on. And I work on that podcast, Song Exploder, as well, among others. And my company, Pink Jumpsuit Music, I used to work at MTV for a long time and doing all of this and working with music supervisors. And now I just do it freelance in my PJs most of the time. I'm super honored to be here.
And Kathleen, I wasn't meaning to cut you off, but actually my first question is directed towards you. So I was going to intro you. Anyhow.
Sorry about that.
I wanted to ask about podcasts that center around music, and in particular that center around a song, like Song Exploder, the very popular podcast that you work as a supervisor on. How do you approach clearance for that show, and how does it differ from, say, clearing a song for film or TV or even another podcast, given that there's presumably a mutually beneficial relationship between the artist and the podcaster?
So Song Exploder has been a really wonderful and interesting journey because when Rishi hired me on that about 5.5 years ago, Song Exploder already existed and people weren't really clearing for podcasts yet. It hadn't quite hit the music industry. And so he and I actually were both learning, mostly me, because I would just keep him updated about things. Rishi is the creator of that podcast and the TV show. And so it's been an evolution is what I can say. And yeah, these days Song Exploder gets pitched artists all the time. Song Exploder does not really reach out and ask for artists to participate. We always are getting pitched. And so there is definitely an orientation in the overall that we hope it's promotional for these artists. And because of that aspect, it is a little bit different from clearing in TV and film because it's focused on a song, because the usage is it's interesting and it's long and it plays the full song at the end. That part in particular has been an interesting thing to navigate with labels and publishers over the years as people have started to get hip to podcasts. In the very beginning when I was clearing things and handling paperwork, I was going to mechanical departments, and they would just send their mechanical license if we did a license. And these days, it's mostly more dealing with the sync departments, but a lot of times it's coming through PR first because we're always being pitched. And Song Exploder is very fortunate to have good relationships with lots of PR firms and artists who want to be on the show. Like the Selena Gomez one that just came out last week was because her publicist wanted that to happen. Like it's really, I feel very rich as a clearance person to get to work on that show because we're sort of fielding things incoming, and then I just go like, hey, just need to paper this, versus like film or TV where I'm like, oh, my client wants to use 30 seconds and here's the scene description and, you know, that kind of thing. I don't know if that answers the question very well, but that's like my first pass.
One thing that's interesting is that that particular show, as you mentioned, has been turned into a Netflix television show. Rishi and your team has partnered with Tremolo Productions and Morgan Neville to develop it into a TV show. So how does licensing work differently on this same exact show now in a visual format?
It was so different. We spent a lot of time in the beginning with our lawyer and with some people, you know, just like with kind of the executive creation and legal team at Tremolo and for the show, and even a little bit with Netflix, like figuring out what our request language was going to be. Because, you know, in the podcast episodes, like the podcast itself is maybe, I mean, it varies, but the episodes are kind of short, like maybe 15 to 25 minutes or something like that. And the TV show, we had to think ahead because we didn't know how it was going to translate to a visual medium yet when we first had to do requesting. And because the episodes focus around a song, from the beginning, I said, we have to have the song cleared before you shoot because otherwise we're up shit creek, right? So we had to try and think really far ahead to like, okay, well, what are all of the possible uses that we might need to translate this audio format to a visual medium? And there was a lot of collaboration to figure out literally just our request language, not the media necessarily, but the use. And so it is very different. And because it's a much bigger, I mean, you say Netflix and immediately it's a whole different ballpark. Like, even though Song Exploder is a very, very well-regarded podcast, it's a different ballpark.
Yeah, and traditionally podcasts have not been giant moneymakers. I mean, that's starting to happen now in some cases, but people don't think of it in the same financial ballpark as television. Does anybody else on the panel want to chime in on this particular point? All right, then I'm going to move to Stephanie at Wondery. Can you talk us through your role at the company a little bit? You came from Discovery Studios. What kind of projects were you working on there, and how did it prepare you for your role at Wondery?
Yeah, actually, up until working at Wondery, I had never worked in audio. I've worked in television my whole life, freelance, and Discovery Studios was just one place that I worked for. I think I worked for every cable network. And I used to joke I worked on mostly food and dude shows. So I did like Wicked Tuna and Mountain Men. And then I did a lot of food shows like, you know, Next Food Network Star and Top Chef, things like that. But I've worked across a range, and I've always really been interested in the music side of things. And I was always the one who'd be digging into the library or trying to clamor to get actual composers. You know, in reality and doc, it's a little harder to do that. But when I came to Wondery, which was about 2.5 years ago, I'm the VP of new shows. So I oversee what we call our always on shows, which airs every week. It's not our mini series, which are kind of what we're most known for, you know, Dirty John, Dr. Dash, Right Next Door, Gladiator. I do the always on shows. So they have a repeatable format so we can air every week. So the music for that's a little bit different than for miniseries, but I think in answer to your question of like what I brought with me, and I think it was, they're both the same in the sense that Wondery tells a lot of long form narrative stories. And so it has the same rules of storytelling, but the music is a little bit different. You can go bigger in television because you have images. And I think in podcasting, because it's a more intimate medium, you have to be more subtle with the way you tell a story, but that makes it even more important because that's all you have is audio. So with music and composing, you create worlds, and it's really exciting. Like Kurt said earlier, it's evolving, and it's a really exciting place to be, like right now. So that's a long answer to your question.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the shows that you do at Wondery are largely narrative versus shows like Song Exploder or my podcast, which are based around music. So the music is functioning to advance that narrative on most of your shows, meaning that it's maybe not as mutually beneficial to the artist to have their song on the show because it's there to further the narrative versus being the spotlight of it. But that said, how does that affect the way that you license music for the shows and the types of deals that you make? Yeah,
actually, that might be a question that Scott, who's done a lot of the work in finding some of our better-known theme songs, could answer.
Well, let's bring Scott in, because Scott does do a lot of work with Wondery.
He does.
Yes. That's kind of a loaded question. Like the licensing aspect, and I'm sure, oh my gosh, Kathleen and I could literally sit and talk about this all day, I'm sure. But from when I started really heavily doing podcasts about a year ago, it's still such an educational experience because it's the Wild West right now. Like there are no rules. There's nothing. And I'm sure Tyler will tell you, and everyone at all of the other major labels and even the indie labels, it's just when I send a request in for a song to license or whatever, I send a request as a podcast. It's not, I'm working on this and it's papered, it's as you would send a request for a feature or a TV show that is, you have your levels, you have you're under $1 million or $1 million to, whatever, you are separated into levels based on your production budget or to, whatever. That's not happening now. You are a podcast and you just send it in as a podcast. And it's very interesting as far as, different budgets and what you can afford and what you can't afford, and how it differs between one major label to another major label. And, major labels right now sometimes have a podcast department and sometimes they don't. And sometimes it's digital and sometimes it's just whoever can do it. And, it's trial and error and just kind of connecting. And I had a lot of help kind of from Wondery in the beginning on, how are you guys seeing, these licenses done? And so they worked with me and we created kind of like a little protocol. And, so we kind of been approaching it from papering it as an internet use. And something that I learned on very quickly is that a lot of the major labels, actually none of the major labels at this point, do perpetuity. They won't grant perpetuity rights for podcasts. And so I think that's really interesting. And so that's also a huge barrier to requests, to number one, what we can afford, but number two, in a year or 3 years, or what was the max that I think a major label would do at this point is 10 years. That is on someone to go back and either have to replace or re-up or do something. And so it's been a lot of trial and error at this point to figure out what formula works and what doesn't. And a lot of times that I'm working with someone that I haven't worked with in the past, I call them and I was like, look, here, this is coming through. Can we hop on the phone? And I have to do kind of like an onboarding thing a lot of times. Like here, who is doing podcast licensing for you guys? Do you have anybody? If not, do you have a digital team? And if not, who is usually handling, everything? And I'll get on the phone and we'll talk. And it's like, look, here is kind of what you can expect from the podcast world. Here is kind of an average budget. Here is, some blah, blah, blah. So it's a lot of back and forth and a lot of education. But then I think at the end, a lot of them understand a lot more about what to expect. And then I can go back to them. And it's just a dialogue back and forth after that. So
do you feel like the fact that major labels won't grant licenses in perpetuity is a disincentive for working with them?
I think maybe yes, sometimes, but I mean, I know there's talks in changing that, and it's a new media, and I know that especially in music and TV and film, a lot of these things are very slow to react, and podcasts have exploded in the past, 5 to 6 years and just taken off. And it's the music industry hasn't had time to react and have, appropriate protocols in place to license for everything. So it's a catch-up game at this point.
Kathleen, you were mentioning that most of the artists that are on Song Exploder these days are pitched to the show, meaning that their publicist or their team sees the promotional value in coming on the show. Does that make it easier to get perpetual licenses if that artist is on a major label, or are you running into the same barriers?
I would say that a lot of what Scott said also applies to what we experience on Song Exploder. And I will also say, in my opinion, just to sort of play devil's advocate, just rewinding it a smidge, I don't think that the lack of perpetual licenses disincentivizes people from using major label or major publisher content. What can is the price, really, but I totally just lost my train of thought. Did I answer that question?
Yes. and I think that's a good place to bring in Tyler. So Tyler, you work at Kobalt, and from your side, how is pitching for a podcast different from pitching for TV and film? And how do you approach pricing?
Yeah, so it's not specific to podcasts. Throughout all media, there is the balance. There's the promotion, and then there's the fees. So for something like Song Exploder, we certainly are more, we're going to go along with seeing a strong promotional value for something like that. We're told all day, this brand using this, top 10 song is going to bring so much promotion to the song. And it's like, nope. But for something like Song Exploder, we do recognize it. We want to be good partners. A lot of times, the label is pitching it, the artist team is pitching it, and we're good partners. We want to go along with it. We expect to see something, but we do keep it in mind. The fees are going to be on the lower end, usually compared to something that's scripted, but we do want to be good partners there, and for the most part, go along with it. I would say in regards to pitching, that's across the industry for publishers and labels, that's not, I'd say it's kind of an underserved media type at the moment. But I expect the more that we see money there, there's going to be a lot more of a focus to pitch and to land placements on, especially the top podcasts.
Is there anybody at Kobalt who's pitching specifically to podcasts, or is it just kind of under the general Synch umbrella? It's, at Kobalt, we break things down by clients, general media types. This person focuses mostly on films, this person, mostly on ads. But with podcasts, I would say that it's not built up enough in the pitching department that it makes sense for only one person. It's mostly, in a lot of ways, it's reactive pitching, not as much proactive. If we see something come up, we're going to try to make something work. But it's not, they're not getting the most attention right now across the industry as far as pitching is concerned, I'd say. I just also want to open it up. If anybody has questions for any of these panelists, go ahead and type it into the chat, and then we'll try to get to as many of those as possible towards the end. So another question for you, Tyler, but for anybody else that has an opinion or has experience with this is podcasts often have trailers in the same way that films have trailers. Do you expect to see a higher license fee for podcast trailers than for actual podcast syncs, similar to how it works in film and TV?
So it all depends on where that trailer is going to live, honestly. If it's going to be just only on the same pages where the episodes are stored, then I would view it more as a bit of as a teaser, as episode 0 kind of hinting at what's to come. And you might see a nominal fee increase, nothing major. We, especially if, we're licensing a bunch of music, we'll try to be as friendly as we can there. If it's going to be on socials and it's going to be elsewhere and they're trying to drive traffic to where those episodes are, it's a different situation. You're going to be seeing a pretty significant bump to fees there. And of course, if there's any sort of media buys behind it, any sort of paid media, then you're looking at a much more significant bump.
This next question is for everybody, but Scott earlier called the podcast world the Wild West. And something that lots of folks are interested in knowing is, how is the process of licensing for podcasts different from that for film and TV? For those that have worked on visual media, should it be easy for them to transition into the world of podcasts pretty naturally? Or are there certain, is there lingo or certain terms that are unique to podcasts, or is it pretty similar? And this is for any of you.
Well, I'll jump in. I was going to say it's a natural transition. It's a formula. It's knowing that you're going to pay for it as an internet use. You're going to always try to ask for perpetuity, even they're going to tell you no if it's a major label. I think one thing that I have actually really enjoyed that's different for me that has been from TV or film is that my budget has been pretty constant. And I do a lot of theme license uses and things like that. And that's actually been pretty nice, because a lot of times when I call Tyler, and I'll call Tyler at least once a week, or anybody else at, Universal or Position, or, all of these other people that I do a lot of business with, it's nice because they know when I call them or when I send them something that they're already going to know. They're going to know what my project is. They're going to know my budget, and they're going to know the audience, everything like that, the usage. And it's been really nice because it's become very formulaic, and it's been nice instead of having to go back and say, here it is. And that has been one nice positive thing about having a constant budget. So.
Anybody else?
I'll just echo what Scott said. I think it's a really natural transition. You're sending requests, you have a description, you just have to make sure that your media ask is what you need. And what I'm seeing is that quotes depend on what the audience is, what is the ad revenue, what is the budget of the show. There's all the moving levers that we all know about from film and TV. So it's not super different, other than that the familiarity of licensors is much less at this point than with film and TV. So we're all sort of figuring it out in the Wild West together. But I think it's a pretty natural transition. And you just, you have your people you go to, and then you're like, hey, not sure if you're my podcast person for this one, or, and the budget is this, but it's pretty natural. And then you just have to pay attention when licenses come in, because still from certain licensors, they're sending you their sync license. And so it might say photo play in there, and you're like, hey, it's probably not an issue for you guys since it's your boilerplate, but just want to flag that. Little things like that. But it's really, I'd say it's a pretty natural transition, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few years. I think we're all going to be much busier with podcast clearance and supervision and stuff like that, especially given where we are with quarantine and everything like that. There's so much is going more digital and audio. So it's an exciting time for sure.
Given that, there are podcast charts on Apple Podcasts, for example, but there aren't as clear of metrics available publicly, what kind of information do labels and publishers ask you to get a sense of the scope of the show? There's so many podcasts out there, they don't necessarily have the time and resources to research every single one when requests come in. So what are the kind of questions they ask to kind of get a sense of how big the show is, how significant it is, and presumably how they would price their licenses?
I don't get asked that anymore, honestly. I think it also kind of goes back to like podcasts being all jumbled into podcasts. And it's not like, this is coming from HBO or this is coming from an indie movie. It's a podcast. And since there aren't public metrics available, it does, like I got asked that a little bit in the beginning, and then I just don't, no one just really asks anymore. And I think it's just because no one knows what to ask. And I think it kind of works in my favor a lot of times, because I get things that maybe I shouldn't be able to afford or things like that. But that's a big thing.
Scott, I want your contacts because I do get asked.
That's great. You said you get asked for your ad revenue and things like that. I do not get asked that. I've never been asked that before.
And there's certain projects where clients are like, I'm not comfortable sharing that. There's certain projects where clients are like, I don't want to share what the actual revenue of the show is, or I don't want to share what the budget is. And so then I'll just go back and say that. But I've also even experienced that, like, for example, if we can talk shop for a second, I just cleared a theme song for a podcast, which will be coming out in about 6 weeks. And they had a pretty amazing budget, but it's no ads. They're not doing any ad buys, anything like that. And the quote that I got back from one particular license store kind of like knocked my socks off. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is what we would have paid for TV 10 years. Like, come on, and it's because of what the budget was, and I had to tell them. So I was a little bummed about
that's why I call, that's why I said earlier, I call them. Like, if they come back with, like, when I first started doing it, they're like, oh yeah, $60,000. And I go, what are you thinking? And so I would call, it's like, well, let's hop on a call. So that's when I hopped on a call, and I'll say, look, this is like breaking down, like, this is what you're getting. This is a production budget per these things, these projects that I'm working on. So let's do some simple math and say, is your, whatever going to match up to this? And if not, then we need to adjust, or I need to find something else, kind of thing. And honestly, and I know Stephanie can, I don't know any of these ad revenue numbers. That's not my department. That's sales. I have nothing to do with that. I am freelance, I work with them as a hired party. That's not my world at all. So and they probably wouldn't give that to me either, because a lot of this is still in the works as this podcast is being put together. So I did run into something. I just did something for that Wondery is doing with MSNBC for Kamala Harris. And so when I sent that through, I got some pushback from a label because they saw Kamala was attached to it. And so that was the first time they're like, well, they were trying to get kind of a ridiculous, just a quote, and they wouldn't pass the quote along that I had put in. And their response was, well, it's Kamala. There's going to be a lot of eyeballs attached to it. And I said, do you know that the last 10 podcast requests that I've sent you have hit #1 for a week and a half? And, so it was just kind of put it in perspective. I was like, you're telling me that all these people are going to have eyeballs because it's the name attached, but all of these other ones that I'm working on also have all of these eyeballs attached to them, or ear balls, whatever you want to call them. But it's kind of the same thing. And I'm sure Stephanie can talk a lot more about that as well from the inside. So, yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask Stephanie something about that. Somebody is asking, Jennifer Smith is asking, Stephanie, how do you structure your music budget for scripted podcast series?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we have 3 different departments in content, which makes us sound really big, but we're not. We're a very small company. But there's new shows always on, which is what I shared with you guys is a format that's repeatable and it comes out every week. So it's a little bit different than our mini series, which are tentpole shows, which are the shows that Scott is talking about. The bigger Dr. Death, Kamala is one of them. They're 6 and done. So when you structure the budget, we know that the tentpoles are going to have more downloads than Always On, even though our Always On do pretty well. So for me, I think it all just depends. It's a great question. I think it all just depends on the show. You really think about what kind of mood, what kind of tone, but there is always only going to be X amount of dollars because we're still podcasting. You know, we don't have scripted television budgets or movie budgets yet. I mean, they're getting a little bigger, but and I think it's interesting what you were saying, Scott and Kathleen, is like, I do think it's an educational process too. When you go to a particularly a major label and you're like, hold on, like, this is what I know podcasts are in the zeitgeist, but this is like what the budgets are, and kind of a reality check. Yeah, so just sort of backtracking to what we asked before, I would wonder if that would be a stumbling block, because I would imagine if you approach a major label enough times and they give you big inflated budgets, you'd probably go more indie. I mean, I don't know. I would just think logically that would be the way to go. And I know we do work with a lot of indie artists, which is cool, you know, I think.
I mean, for everybody on the panel, would it be accurate to say that the overall budget for an episode, or perhaps even a whole series of a podcast, is sometimes comparable to that of a really strong sync for television? Meaning, like, the cost of a single license for like an HBO show might be the same as the cost to produce an entire podcast, or maybe even a series.
Oh, that's a Stephanie question.
I'm like, I don't know how much is the license for an HBO show.
I know, I don't either. And I don't think I'm allowed to say exactly what our budgets are, even if I knew. But let's just say, like, obviously our budgets, I mean, you can do like, what would be ad revenue is based on downloads, and what is the share in the Nielsen rating versus downloads. Like, podcasting is growing, but where is it compared to television or movies and the kind of budgets? Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it comes like it's all over.
We're being vague about it. Sorry, Scott.
I mean, I've licensed like in podcast use for non-wondering things, or for anything, for anywhere between $100 to 10,000, and I mean, like that doesn't narrow it down, but that really does tell you that there's not any rules. Like, it's kind of all over the place, and it's not, I don't think it's because of the usage, or, you know, yes, it will vary if it's in the episode or if it's a theme or whatever, but it doesn't that much, just because it's just, and I think that the price difference is just because there's nothing that's set up, you know, like I will get quoted one thing at a label, and then I'll go and clear this, I'll get the publishing cleared at one, and then I'll have to go to another label, and they're like, what are you thinking? That's nowhere near like even our price minimum. And, you know, so it's just like, it's not, there's not a lot of communication. And so I have actually started doing a lot of customs, and that has been something that has actually become really great, because it has become less expensive for me to do a custom and do a full buyout and own everything, you know, minus the writer share for sync. I mean, for streaming, than it is to license a massive song. And I can, you know, I end up owning the song, or the client ends up owning the song for perpetuity, and they can license it back out or do whatever they want with it. But that's something that I found that has been really great, actually. And I've started doing that a lot as of late.
Does anybody know if BMI, ASCAP, or CSAC even monitor podcasts for royalties?
Can we not talk about that?
Right.
I'm really curious also about Stephanie as well, because I'm very curious to see as far as clearance, because I have never once had to turn a Q sheet in to anybody. And also when I've had talks with the PROs, they don't even have the capability at this point to track podcasts. It's not even on their radar. And I think there are discussions being had, but that's not happening in the next even couple of years. And, you know, I think that it's, you know, like the music industry itself, you know, even majors are still playing catch up. So you can imagine where the PROs, you know, are also playing catch up, and they're having to develop these things. And that also totally branches out into what Kathleen brought up earlier when she started licensing. She was going to the mechanicals department, and there's a lot of disconnect on, is this a sync license? Because technically it's not a sync license, it's audio to audio, it's not video to audio. And that, you know, that's a whole other can of worms that you just opened. You know, like, should artists be able to collect mechanicals from downloads, you know, that are on podcasts? And that'll be a whole other thing that PROs have to develop with a lot of these DSPs or anything like that, where these podcasts are living on, if they're going to be royalty payouts for any of the artists that are featured on any of the podcasts. Because as of now, there's no way for any artist to collect any type of revenue other than what they get paid for the sync for podcasts at this point.
I have 2 questions and comments about that. Can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
So when I first started on Song Exploder 5.5 years ago, I called the PROs and I was like, do we need to, how are you guys handling this? Is this a mechanical? And we worked through it and they were like, no, it's not a mechanical because of blah, 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 blah. So, it's still the Wild West. We're all still figuring it out. But then Scott, I have a question for you, and maybe this is sensitive.
Yes.
And if you can't answer, it's fine. But so you're like, I've never once had to turn in a cue sheet. And then I go, yeah, but aren't your clients signing licenses that have a whole boilerplate paragraph in there about how the podcast has to be distributed on a platform that has deals with the PROs? So are your clients just signing those and you're like, we'll figure it out?
No. So the licensing is the wording is a lot different. I have my own license and things like that we developed that I send kind of back and forth, because a lot of times I'll ask, and that kind of goes back to your question about, licenses. So a lot of majors will have their own licenses that they're sending out, but they'll send them to me and I'm like, no, that's not you can't, this is an incorrect license because you're asking for this and this. This is a sync license, and so I kind of have my own that I've kind of gone back with some legal departments and things like that. I'm like, the wording needs to reflect this because this is how it is and whatever. So I actually have my own that I use most of the time. Sometimes people who understand that I've worked with, they have kind of adapted their license to reflect everything. I work with a lot of the councils for clients that I have on saying, here are the wordings that need to be reflected and things like that. So I actually have my own that I created that I've been sending out or been sending to other publishers or labels for them to use as well to adapt. So maybe in the future, you'll be getting one of my templated licenses.
I'm just impressed. I'm like, you're getting them to sign your boilerplate? Woo!
I just want to point out Scott's video was glitching out a bit, and I think it was because the PROs are hacking into his internet connection.
They're so mad.
I was hoping there might be someone here from them who could speak to this, because I want to know.
Well, if there is anybody from a PRO, please chime in.
I did just want to add something, Scott, you had asked me, when we use music libraries, when it's not commissioned music going through a music supervisor, we do ask for certain rights and we do turn in cue sheets. But I think it is up to the music library house, if it's commissioned music, meaning they have original music coming in from composers or bands, that they are then assumingly accounting to them and to the organizations. That's what I assume, but we do have to turn in cue sheets.
The interesting thing about that is how would the PROs would have to track the actual streaming numbers, which are not made available.
They're not available. Yeah, they're not public. Yeah,
well, and exactly. Even those numbers are not super accurate. There's different ways they're calculated.
Yeah, and it would also be interesting to differentiate between people that happen to download the podcast and keep it on a device permanently versus streaming and all of that whole can of worms.
Yeah. Well, and then you also have other DSP platforms that are behind the paywall, there are several podcast networks that have their own app or things like that there are all of these downloads and things like that are behind a paywall as well. So that further kind of adds to the mix of where is and what is the correct number of streams and downloads and things like that. So
can I ask Tyler, do you at Kobalt, is there any kind of orientation or awareness around this in terms of royalties for musicians from podcasts?
I would say, we all know that sometimes the marketplace is moving quicker, and we all have to play catch up. That sounds like something that's happening here. Certainly something that I want to dig more into, but I can't give a very clear answer on that right now, unfortunately.
It's the Wild West, people.
One question that has come up is, has anybody on this panel observed a song taking off because of its association with a particular podcast, a song becoming a hit or becoming newly, getting some new energy around it. I can think of one off the top of my head because I'm label mates and friends with the guys from the Zombies, and their song "A Rose for Emily" was used on S-Town as kind of like the theme song, the closing theme song. And it definitely generated new interest in that song and in the band. And they started closing their sets with that song because it became so popular again. But can anybody else think of an example?
I don't know of any.
Well,
I've asked for Song Exploder. I've asked for years. I've been like, hey, can you make it part of your agreement with artists that they track like streaming and downloads after the episode comes out? Because that would be good information for us, especially with labels and publishers. It's good leverage, but we still don't have that information. So I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't think I have either, but I've started like, because a lot of the podcasts that I work on are being turned into TV, either limited series or things like that. So advice from a friend, I don't know who's actually watching right now. I've started writing in pre-clears for the TV adaptation when I send in the request. And I know there's already interest around some of the ones that I have worked on that are going to TV for bringing in the theme song for the podcast to the TV. So that will be something that will be done as well. And I know that there was, I know that there have been a couple that have kind of come from that as well. So I'm thinking in the next year or so, as you see, all of these shows that are coming out that are going to be adapted from podcasts, that a lot of the songs that you have heard as theme uses on the podcast are going to be at least somewhat integrated into the limited series version.
Here's a question for Stephanie. How does music help podcasts tell a story?
My favorite question of all. I think what's so cool about audio is that because that's all you have, right? I talked about this a little earlier. There's no images to help you tell the story. Music tells the emotional story. The plot story is through the voice, but the voice can only do so much. The music tells the emotional story. And what I think is really interesting that's different, I talked a little bit about how much more subtle it is in podcasting, but we use like a lot of like ambi beds and a lot of like, you can't do like a John Williams E.T., over the moon kind of score. It's just going to sound ridiculous and melodramatic, right? So there's a lot of like establishing a tone and a mood and creating a world, an immersive world in which you're enveloped. And yeah, so I think it's similar. You tell an emotional story in film and television as well, but I think it's so key in audio.
That makes sense because as a film and TV composer myself, obviously the scenes where there's heavy dialogue, the music has to be more subtle. Mm-hmm. And in film and TV, you have the visual component, so you can often, create larger scale music for places without any dialogue. But with podcasts, there's typically dialogue the whole way through for the most part.
It's interesting too. Scott and I were talking about this yesterday. Like a lot of the theme songs we have on Wondery are songs that I think, right, Scott, are on Spotify, and they're pretty hummable. They're commission songs, but they have lyrics, and they're great as the theme song in the beginning when you're setting something up. But it's hard to use something with lyrics when you're having to listen to the audio because they compete with each other. So I think sometimes you can, although I don't prefer it in television, but you can get away with it in television, I think.
So one of the things that I think about a lot is how cycles tend to repeat themselves. And, we're seeing that in music as singles are becoming the predominant format, and with podcasts, radio dramas existed decades and decades ago. And I wonder if there's anything to be learned for the way that music was used and licensed for radio dramas that could then be applied to podcasts. Presumably with that, since it was on radio, I'm sure that the artists that wrote the material did get royalties via PROs at the time. But on the other hand, lots of the instrumental music was performed live on the air. So that was presumably work for hire. I'm not sure because I wasn't alive back then. But it would be interesting to research what was happening back then and see how it applies to what's happening now.
Yeah, you think were those studio endeavors back then? Because back then they had a lot of studio musicians that I wonder if they just tapped them to do whatever, the jingles or the radio spots. Yeah, interesting.
All right, I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable chiming in with questions on chat. We still have a little bit more than a half hour, so if folks that are watching this have specific questions, we would love to hear from you. So here's another question. For theme songs, is there any difference in the way that those are cleared? And how common are theme songs on shows, for example, on Wondery? Do all of your shows have theme songs, and what percentage of them are works for hire versus licensed?
Yeah, every single show has a theme song, whether it's it's a miniseries, 7 or 8 episodes, or it's a recurring show. Every single one of them has one, and that's also been interesting. That was also been an interesting thing that I did for a show called The Daily Smile. It's literally every single day. It's like a 10 minutes, like The Daily, but it's like a happy version of like The Daily. It's the good news digest kind of thing, and that was really interesting. Trying to do that license for something that occurs every single day. And so it was a process kind of going back and forth. I mean, we found a song that was amazing and it was literally written for the show. I mean, not literally written, but it was so perfect that it meshed that well. And it was interesting trying to come up with language that matched, that was feasible financially to be able to use this, but also, was favorable for both sides. And so, I mean, it ended up working out, and it's kind of just like like everything else is, like, let's try it and see if it works kind of thing. But so far it's worked. And theme uses are interesting. I mean, as far as, I feel like Tyler also touched on this earlier, talking about like theme uses and like trailers and things like that. When I send a submission for like a trailer use or something like that, it's different because it's not really a trailer. It's like what Tyler said. It's like a teaser. It's living on the RSS page for the podcast. So what I do is I paper it as one episode. I mark that first episode or that trailer, that intro to the series as the first episode. So
and
essentially,
I just want to interject for folks that don't know what the RSS page is. That's the actual podcast feed that is then disseminated to the Spotifys and the Apple Podcasts of the world. So what you're saying is like there isn't a separate trailer that's being promoted on a separate platform. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So you'll have like your episode 1 will literally be introduction to insert name of podcast or whatever you choose to name it. And then episode 2 is the actual first episode of the series. And that's just how it appears on the RSS feed. And so it's just become a lot simpler because, and I think Kathleen will also back me up on this, when anybody hears trailer, they're like, oh, money, and so it's like, no, it's not a trailer. Let's hop on the phone. Let me explain when I say trailer, what that means, because, and it's explaining what words mean and things like that. So a teaser has become a little bit more of a word that I've used to calm people down from their exorbitant requests that they send me, or fees that I get when I say trailer. So, but now it's kind of calmed down because a lot of people that I work with understand when I say trailer that I'm actually just going to pay for an extra episode. So yeah.
just to chime in on what Scott was saying about daily shows that want to use a theme song, those in my experience are usually the toughest to make work. I mean, if I'm seeing the full per side fee and then I'm dividing it by the number of episodes and I see that it's ending up at $10, I'm like, this is pretty tough to make happen. But on top of that, I would also say that probably 50%, if not more, of the requests that I get for podcasts are solely for intro theme uses.
So given that the metrics are so difficult to see and lots of them are not even public, what kind of questions do you ask when you're determining how to price a license, Tyler?
So for other media types, especially film, I'm going to rely heavily on what the production budget is. It isn't as easy to just rely on that info for podcasts. Usually I am going to do some research. I'm going to see, relative to other podcasts, where this one's at in popularity. And it's just, I am making assumptions. If it's, if you have more ratings, I'm assuming more streams. I'm assuming more ad revenue if there are ads. So I'm going to price accordingly. But it's nothing like I see that this one is, a little bit more attention on it, and I'm going to go just in crazy high fees. I have a window that I generally will operate in. For a little bit of context, not to get too specific on fees, usually it's going to be anywhere from about 500 to about 5,000. So those 5,000s are extensive uses generally, and those are per side fees. So it can get up there, but as a whole, I'm operating within that window. I'm going to go slightly more to the higher side if I see that this is getting a ton of views, and I kind of just operate within there.
Somebody raised this question, and it relates to what you were talking about earlier, Scott, but everybody else can chime in as well. So the licensing language is slightly different for podcasts, given that podcasts can be downloaded. So could you talk about what supervisors might need to do to adjust their templates? I don't know if you've put some provisions in for that in your template, Scott. You mentioned that you put together your own kind of agreement boilerplate.
Yeah, Kathleen can reiterate what she was talking about earlier. But yeah, it's fairly simple especially if you're just sending a request. You're asking for, it's an internet use worldwide, because if you're distributing on any of these DSPs, they are worldwide. And a lot of the podcasts that I work on end up being translated into other languages as well. So I have to ask for the worldwide use. And then you're marking it whatever use you're asking for, and that's very much it. Now, when it comes back to the language and things like the actual license, that becomes a little more difficult, going back to what Kathleen was talking about, and just kind of making it up as I go, if I can be honest. Yeah, I think Kathleen will kind of back me up on the language that she's adding. So she might want to expand a little bit more on some technical language that she might add, because a lot of times she's working in some interesting scenarios over there. So
I just make sure in the media that it I have a boilerplate podcast media language that I pretty much use for any client, tweaking as necessary where needed, but I make sure that it includes streaming and download, and then sometimes the licensors will come back and approve the exact language I've asked for. Some licensors have their own podcast language now, or their own internet language. And if it's worrisome in any way, where if it limits something, like it limits the streaming on the website, or it doesn't have download or whatever, I just call them up and I'm like, hey, this is going to be downloaded. That's what this is. So there's, as circling back to a theme that came up earlier in the conversation, there's still a bit of an educational element involved, but the way I see it, as long as you include streaming and download, and then you have whatever language you need to include all the possible places it might be, like the RSS feed, or including but not limited to. That's one of my favorite phrases personally.
Oh, that's my favorite.
You just go with that.
Uh-huh. I list my top 3 DSPs, and then but not limited to, and that's my favorite language. Yeah,
exactly, including but not limited to. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and when you are reaching out to labels and publishers, an issue that I run into quite a bit, please do make sure to say that it's going to be permanent downloadable, because a lot of times we'll see temporary downloads listed on the request or something like that, and you're setting yourself up for a bad situation, because then when it goes to license, then if we have to escalate that to being permanent downloads, then you're looking at a fee increase. So whereas you probably would have gotten away with right about the same fee for permanent downloads if you just said that from the beginning.
What percentage of the music that you use on your show, Scott, is licensed versus coming from royalty-free libraries?
Ooh, that's also a good question for Stephanie as well. Actually, let her talk about that, because I usually come in a lot at the very end, because they work with a sound designer. And so a lot of the sound designer, is a lot of the sound design is already in place before I get it. So that's where a lot of my influences come. So maybe Stephanie would be a better person to ask right now, and then I can add in some sprinkles at the end.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you have a sound designer that you work with, but do you have composers that you hire to score entire series as well?
No, Stephanie, can you answer that?
I can, yes. I think a couple of the miniseries used composed music that composed the series. For our ongoing formats, it's a little harder to do that because of the speed with which they come out. But we work with various sound designers on different shows, and there are some that are also composers. So they might compose some of the music, and they might use library music for other parts. We have one host who's also a designer and composer, and he composes everything for both of his weekly podcasts that come out. So I think it depends. Yeah.
Someone's asking this question, and it might be a good question for Stephanie and Kathleen, and that's, do the sponsors of the shows that you work on have any sort of editorial say? And if so, how transparent is it?
I'll go first because my answer will be pretty short. To my knowledge, no. They just pay.
What about the artists that come on Song Exploder? Do they get to listen back to the episode and approve it before it's released?
I don't know the answer to that, because that's more of a talent question. But my guess would be probably we don't give approval rights. I mean, everyone's always trying to be able to make the content they want.
Yeah. Stephanie?
Yeah, no, they don't have any say in our content unless they're a branded episode, unless they are paying for a branded content episode, and then they will approve, but not in our regular shows or miniseries.
Kathleen, you said you've been working on Song Exploder for 5.5 years now. How has your role evolved? I mean, that's a podcast that's kind of been at the vanguard of the podcast explosion. And, it's one of the most popular music podcasts in the world, and one of the most popular podcasts in general. How has your role changed, and how have the needs of the show evolved over that time?
It definitely has evolved. In the beginning, it has evolved, and I have evolved as in what I do as a person. Because in the beginning, when Rishi hired me, I was like, all right, let's try and figure this out. And it was also a more nascent time in the industry of podcasts, and in terms of what labels and publishers knew and didn't know. So we were all sort of figuring it out. And as the years have gone by, one of the biggest changes, or I guess it would be maybe obvious additions that didn't become obvious until a couple of years ago, was now there's a whole back catalog that we have to manage and I have to keep track of. And, I'm closer with the show creator because we're always talking, and that's maybe kind of a boring answer.
But what do you mean when you say you have to manage the back catalog?
I mean that there are lots and lots of episodes that that build up that have to, I have to keep an eye on certain ones of those. I can't get too specific, but
like, for example, if one of them only granted you a limited license time-wise.
For example, yes.
Okay.
So there's it's mostly just evolved in that way. Like Rishi and his team handle the booking, and it's become a little bit more, my role as the clearance person is a little more directorial than it was in the beginning, where I was just sort of like a hired gun. But now it's just a lot more embedded. And I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how it's evolved. And I will say, and I know that we're not talking about this, but the transition to the TV show, adding that on, that has been a whole evolution of its own because of the rights we had to ask for and the uses and like what the show is and all of that kind of thing. So it's been a very fun adventure. I will say that.
And just for folks that might be curious, who are some of the artists that are on the TV show of Song Exploder?
So it's very exciting. We have episodes, they're probably posting at like midnight tonight, I think, but we have REM, Alicia Keys, Ty Dolla $ign, and Lin-Manuel Miranda.
There you go.
It's a little 4-episode appetizer.
Had you worked on podcasts prior to Song Exploder?
No.
Were you a podcast fan prior to Song Exploder?
I didn't even know what podcasts were. I mean, like, I think I'd heard of them. Do you know what I mean? And it just, a couple different people recommended me to Rishi, which was so lucky for me. And so I had to just kind of learn. And I remember, like, in the beginning, this was probably in 2016, I had to talk with a label, and they were asking me, what were they asking? I'm trying to remember, but I wasn't super familiar with podcasts yet. Like, sure, I'd been working on Song Exploder, but I, as a clearance person, have kind of a terrible habit of not consuming the media that I work on. I just sort of like, it's my job, whatever, moving on, forget about it. So I wasn't super familiar with podcasts in terms of the user interface of them as a consumer of them, even a year into working on the show. And I had a conversation with the label, and they were having like a challenge with the fact that the full song is played at the end, and they wanted to like limit it, or they wanted us to put a link in the podcast to play the song on Spotify. And I didn't know the mechanics of podcasts. So I remember calling Rishi and saying like, hey, they're asking for this thing. And he was like, no, that like, you can't, I mean, I guess you could in the show notes, but in the podcast itself, that would be like trying to get a hamburger out of your TV. That it doesn't work that way.
Yum.
So it's
Delicious.
really been a learning journey for all involved, other than probably Rishi, other than, I mean, he's probably learned too. I can't speak for him.
He was pretty smart at the beginning, so maybe he can't learn anything else.
I know, right?
Stephanie, what about you? Were you a podcast fan before you started working at Wondery?
I was a huge podcast fan. I felt like I wanted in, I was working in reality where it seemed like networks were getting more and more afraid because people were unplugging and they weren't sure how to retain their viewership. So it got more micromanagey and the budgets got smaller, and the excitement I used to feel about creating something new went away. And meanwhile, I saw this wild west of storytelling and people doing really unique and creative things there. And yeah, I loved podcasts. In fact, Dirty John, I think, was one of the first ones I listened to after Serial, probably like everybody else. Serial was my point of entry, like a lot of folks.
And I think that came out at either the end of 2014, beginning of 2015.
October, 2014.
Which wasn't that long ago, yet it seems so long ago in the scope of podcasts.
I know. It's crazy. Like, if you think about like television, I don't know when television became more common in households, but like, just imagine 6 years into television, even though podcasts have been around since 2004, like imagine where it was, or where early filmmaking was just 6 years in. And like, think of like how far we can go and new things that can happen in this world in terms of audio and storytelling.
Scott, did you have any favorite podcasts before you started servicing Wondery?
Servicing. That sounds so dirty. Yes, I did actually, and it was a Wondery podcast. It was one that they did called Imagine Life, and it is. And I always tell people this, and it's not a show that I work on either, which I'm kind of sad about. But it's a first-person narrative about someone famous before they're famous. They don't use any like big names or anything like that throughout the podcast, and it's like kind of like you have to guess. They drop clues throughout the whole episode, and then you at the end of the episode, if you haven't guessed who it is, they reveal who it is. And it's so great. I can listen to it with my kids in the car when we're driving or anything. And the sound designer does a great job and just kind of creating like an audioscape kind of thing. And I like it. So that was my favorite, and still is my favorite.
Tyler, what kind of feedback are you getting from some of your artists as far as like really positive syncs to podcasts, if any?
Yeah, I think I can kind of go based off what Scott was saying earlier about educating clients on what you should expect to see. A lot of them obviously aren't seeing these theme uses roll in all day. So if they've seen a TV theme use, they're going to think that they're going to be seeing semi-similar fees, which is just not the case. So it's a lot about educating them on standard fees for podcasts, and then going based off that. What do you think of the creative? A lot of times they really want to know a lot about the creative. As much info as we can have on the production company behind it, the names involved. A lot of clients really like to get all that info. So, but yeah, I mean, I've had clients that are very, very happy to be part of these podcasts, and they're cool to do it for very low money because they love the opportunity, and others that are going to want to see that fee.
We've touched on a little bit this transition of podcasts into television shows, proper television shows. But I'm curious to know, as far as visual podcasts, Kurt is asking, as more podcasts are being streamed, not only as an audio version, but including visual content in the actual podcast itself, how does that affect licensing, if at all?
In terms of rights needed?
Yeah, in terms of the deal, now that it's synced to a visual medium, and does it change the pricing? Does it change the process at all? And this is for anybody on the panel.
Yeah, I'll say I've actually never been in that situation where I've cleared something for audio only, and now it's going audio visual. I do think that you probably are going to be seeing a little bit of a fee increase, just because you are entering that TV market, and we do expect fees to be higher. But I think other people could probably speak a little bit better on this.
And I'm not necessarily talking about TV, but I'm talking about visual podcasts. Like, for example, like the Joe Rogan show is always videotaped, or the Neil Brennan show is videotaped, not taped, but recorded and then streamed. So does that affect the license fees at all if it's a visual podcast?
I wouldn't say heavily at all. Really, I'd say you're looking at very comparable fees.
One thing I love about podcasts is that I can listen to them when I'm walking around outside or on a bike ride or whatever. So I've never understood the appeal of visual podcasts, to be honest.
Yeah, I like the immersive, just the audio, so I have a weird thing. So I have chromesthesia, which means I see color with sound. And that's what I've always really liked about podcasts, and working with someone who's a really great sound designer is they create this entire world, and you can literally just close your eyes, and it lets you, I guess it kind of goes back to like when you were a kid, and you use your imagination. It's what is it, SpongeBob or whatever that does the imagination thing. That's like what it makes you think of. It makes you go back and it makes you use your head, and you create these own worlds for yourself instead of having them already visually dictated to you. You get to go back and you get to use everything, and and that's what I enjoy, because everyone is going to have a different experience. And I think one of the really cool things that I thought was really fascinating is when I've gone to some of the listening parties that Wondery has done, you literally walk into a room and they hand you a sleep mask or an eye mask, and they sit you in a room and they essentially sensory deprivation where you can't see, and they play it in a black room with your eye mask on. And I think it's great because it's just a way for you to kind of get back and use your other senses more than your visual senses.
Yeah, I mean, I think screens are ubiquitous now. We're all learning about how bad screens are for our brains. So podcasts, even though they're often played from devices that have screens, can be sort of an antidote to the negative impact of screens, if they're good.
As we sit here staring at our Zooms.
Exactly. It's kind of ironic, but this isn't really a podcast, is it?
No.
So we have about 12 minutes left. I want to open this up to questions from anybody on chat. Okay, here we go. May is asking what the turnaround times are like in podcasts. How far in advance are you giving a song to clear before the episode is released? And actually, Stephanie, you mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why you don't hire composers on Wondery shows all that often is because the turnaround time is significantly faster than film or TV. So what are turnaround times like? And then Kathleen and Scott, maybe you could kind of answer the question about how long you have to clear songs in general.
Yeah, I think there's a longer time for a miniseries because there's longer lead time. It's a lot of investigative reporting that's happening in the moment, where our ongoing shows, we have a faster turnaround. So you're exactly right. Yeah. I mean, well, again, our sound designers, our composers, they're also people who work in Pro Tools, so they do it all. They put in the sound effects and they compose and they do it to the script. So they usually have anywhere from 6 to 10 days to turn around an episode, depending.
It's interesting. I wonder if there will be a new term for the people that are kind of hybrids between sound designers and composers. You listen to, one of the very first kind of immersive, sound design shows I can think of is Radio Lab. And I can't really say whether it's composition or sound design. It's interesting.
Yeah, I would definitely say they use sound design, but I don't know if they hire, maybe Kathleen would know. I don't know if they hire composers or what kind of music they're using. I don't know if anybody would know, but yeah, they're like genius, top of the.
Well, it's almost like ambient tonal stuff that you could say it's sound design or you could say it's music. It's like.
Love and Radio does that too.
Yeah.
Love and Radio is really good in that way.
Kathleen and Scott, how quickly do you have to turn licenses around in general?
It depends on the project. It really just depends on the project. Like there was one I worked on a couple of years ago where they knew a couple months ahead of time that they were going to want to use some Prince songs. And so I was able to have a good lead time. Sometimes on Song Exploder, it's like 2 weeks. It can really, I find that it really depends. I always like to counsel clients, the more time, the better, especially if it's like a small budget. So will be a small fee or something like that. I like to try and give my licensors as much time as possible rather than hit them with like a rush, because I'm always going to them and they're working hard and they're slammed all the time. So, I'm like, you should allow 3 to 6 weeks, but usually it's more like 2.
Oh, I'm the one who says, urgent, 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 urgent. I need this tomorrow. I did that to Tyler a couple of weeks ago. I was like, I need this tomorrow. Can we get this cleared? And he came through and he was amazing and we got it done. But I mean, there was a lot of other factors behind it. But yeah, I mean, a week, a day, a month, it just kind of, it honestly really depends when I get the episode. Because sometimes I won't get the episode because it's being tweaked or whatever. Because when I get the episode, most of the work is done. The sound design and the composition is done when I get it. So I have, I just get to come around and put the garnish on top and, and add the music for the theme, or, if there are there are clears that need to be done for music that has been dropped in, that they need to clear, that has been selected by whoever the director or the producer is on the podcast, then I'll go back and I'll clear that. Or sometimes I need, a month or, 2 when I'm doing a custom. It kind of depends on when I get the episode and when it's starting to be promoted, when they have that first trailer, as I say, trailer released on the RSS feed. So, because that kind of dictates my timeline.
Jordan is asking, what are the consequences of not clearing music on podcasts? Have there ever been cases of legal action taken against all the podcasts that are not clearing songs? I don't know. You go ahead.
I would say I haven't run into any. I mean, I think it's still now. There's still it's a gray area, and I wish there was a better thing to say gray area. But I mean, it is like a cease and desist maybe. But I've never had that. And I think that's because no one really knows. So I mean, I don't know. And that's an interesting point for you, Kathleen. I don't know if you guys have ever run into an issue down the road, a year or so afterwards, that something comes up and you're like, oh, we need to address this. So I'm also curious about that from your perspective.
So I'm trying to determine if I can tell you guys this. So like, I think I can, because we've been advised by like a billion lawyers. Song Exploder, when an artist is talking about like their influences or something like that, and there's little clips, stuff like that. Song Exploder is a documentary podcast. And so Song Exploder has been advised by 500 billion different legal teams, including their own and including people in radio, that those are technically fair use. Obviously, we all know that fair use is not a clearance strategy. It's a defense in court. And I'm not a lawyer, so I never advise on that. But that's, just in case you all thought I was like an amazing rock star clearing 15 songs per episode, I'm not. Because those documentary uses, those little clips when someone's talking about like, oh, I love the bass line and blah, 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 blah. On the podcast, we consider that fair use. There was an experience maybe a couple years ago where a publisher came and said, hey, we noticed this thing, you never licensed it. And we included our lawyer and we just said like, oh, we see that as fair use. And the publisher was like, well, yeah, but we charge for fair use fees. And our lawyer was like, well, we don't pay for them. So that was the end of that.
So then they didn't even proceed with the cease and desist.
No. And I would imagine that it probably also would depend like on, I mean, if someone's going to like hit you with a suit or hit you with any kind of a big deal thing, it's only because they see that there's benefit to doing that. If it's a small podcast that doesn't have a huge listenership or has like a relatively modest listenership and budget, like what are they gonna, like the most they would probably do is send a cease and desist. It's going to cost them more in people hours to try and be a bully about it than they would ever get out of anything.
It'll be interesting to see if there's increased scrutiny as the profile of the show will presumably rise due to the TV show. But I'll say, as a podcaster that's put out, about 300 episodes, I was advised the same thing when I started, that, if we're talking about, if I have, Clyde Stubblefield, who was James Brown's drummer and the most sampled drummer of all time, and he's talking about Funky Drummer, and we play, he's talking about the day that they recorded it and how he got dragged out of bed by James to record this break that became the foundation of hip hop as well. If we play a little excerpt from that song, that counts as fair use because it's germane to the conversation. And I've never gotten a cease and desist. I have gotten the content blocked on YouTube when the RSS feeds YouTube, and often it gets blocked even though I do have permission from the label that's blocking it. So it's just the algorithm it's like blocking it. I also get blocked from posting my own songs on social media on YouTube. So go figure. Like if I post, if somebody's posting an Instagram story of my song and then I try to repost it, for some reason Universal blocks it, even though I'm the originator of it and I technically own the masters. Anyway, I think that's a good place to kind of, we're coming to the end here, and I notice Ed is back. Ed, do you want to kind of wrap it up?
Sure, that'd be great.
But,
I want to just, go ahead. Finish.
I was just going to say, we did see some text in this chat, so I'm sure all of our panelists, if you could just provide your home addresses so people can send you their mixtapes, that would be great. Thanks.
Cool. Well, what a fantastic, webinar podcast. I mean, really shows you the amount of work that has to get done, by the way, to make, to protect everybody involved in these podcasts. So that's up to us as a guild to try to sort of set the table for that. That's my opinion. But thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kurt, for sponsoring this. It was fantastic. I think everybody really enjoyed it. Again, this will be up again for view, I believe, Hunter, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we usually do it about 2 weeks out or a week out, depending on how we can turn around the edit. So,
yeah, cool. And I think we should, at some point circle back and do another one and, bring in the PROs and everybody else to start to talk about this, because I think it's a very engaging conversation. So, again, thank you all, man. It was really fantastic.
Yeah, I just want to mention too, we just put a link to the Guild of Music Supervisors How to Join section. So if you guys are not members, you can kind of look into different tiers that we offer, or if you're a singer-songwriter, or we have a tier called the Friends of the Guild category. So feel free to look into that and check out our application process. But even the Friends of the Guild gets special access to certain events and perks throughout the year, discounts. So take a look, it's in the chat, and we would just really want to say thank you from the Guild to all you guys joining in.
All right, everybody, have a safe night, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
And thanks again to our panelists. I'll start with Kathleen
Absolutely.
this time, and Stephanie, Tyler, and Scott. It was a pleasure speaking with all of you, and I'm
Thank
shocked
you,
that
Joe.
I'm glad that everybody stuck around. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe, for amazing questions.
Yeah.
And
Great
Scott,
moderating.
Tyler,
Thank you.
Stephanie, Hunter, Levi, Ed. Thanks, everyone.
I look forward to meeting you all in real life in about 3 years or something.
in a million.
All right, good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.